The animals went in 2 by 2. The animals went in 2 by 2. The animals went in 2 by 2. The elephant and the kangaroo, and they all went into the ark for to get out of the rain. Isn't Noah's Ark a lovely story for the children? I'm sure some of us still have board books at home. You know, the cute animals went onto the ark. The fluffy animals went onto the ark. The fierce animals went onto the ark. And there at the end, the lovely picture, animals sticking their heads out of the windows, Noah and smiling, rainbow in the background. But then we've just read the real story of Noah's Ark. And it's a shock, isn't it? Reading it as an adult, this is clearly not a story primarily for little children. Now, if our only idea of God and the Bible and Jesus comes from sanitized, sugar-coated children's stories, then I don't blame you for seeing Jesus as irrelevant and about as useful as an imaginary friend. This is not the God that we know and worship here at All Hallows, because the real God is capable of doing things that might shock us to the core. Noah's Ark reveals a God who takes evil with deadly seriousness, and yet is determined to rescue and save. And so if we want an encounter with the real God, well, then we need to engage with how he reveals himself in his word here in Genesis chapters 6 and 7. If you're just visiting us this morning, this passage wasn't particularly picked for today for the baptism. We're just continuing our sermon series through the book of Genesis. We're looking at these early chapters of human prehistory, and we're seeing their relevance for today. This morning we're going to go on a journey of hope and despair, or we might say judgment and grace, a bit like we saw last week if you were here with us last week. And we're going to make 5 really brief stops on our journey. So first of all, the state of the world. The book of Genesis declares that the universe and we were made by a loving creator God. That he made the world and made us very good in the beginning. That we are wonderfully and uniquely made in his image. That we are precious in his sight and unique in all creation. But tragically, humanity fell from that original goodness. And so that image of God that we bear is tragically spoiled. And as we've traced that through Genesis in chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6, things get worse and worse and worse as humanity gets further and further from God. And this is where we're up to in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11. This is the verdict. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Now it repeats again and again, corrupt, corrupt, filled with violence. It is a damning evaluation of the prehistoric world. But would you say things are much better now? You turn on the TV, you turn on the radio, you open your news app, and what do we see? We see violence everywhere. We see wars between countries and regions. We see communities that are torn apart by fighting, feuds that last for generations and generations and generations. We see that in our own families, tragically, don't we, as well? Family versus family, friend versus friend, individual versus individual. There is violence everywhere. And I don't just mean physical violence, but there's verbal violence, emotional violence as well. When we take a cold, hard look at the world and at ourselves, we see things are deeply messed up. How do you explain that? How do you explain the way things are? Or, maybe more pointedly, who's to blame? Well, the Bible explains it better than anything else I've ever come across. That we are capable of such astonishing good and creativity and beauty, and yet at the same time, great evil in the very same person. Well, it's because we're made in the image of God, but that image is severely marred, it's corrupted. And that's a problem for each of us. Now, you'll be relieved to know that I've not murdered anyone. But I have, plenty of times, raised my fists in anger. Now, maybe you're thinking you've never got into a fight with anyone, although, if you've been a child, I don't believe you. But maybe just hypothetically, let's say you've never got into a fight with anyone. Well, I bet you've torn someone to pieces with your words, though. Humanity, you see, is not like mouldy cheese, but is more like mouldy bread. Let me explain. In our house, we quite enjoy hard cheese, and so if you open up the fridge, you'll find a lump somewhere stashed behind perhaps a jar of beetroot or something. And you find it's been there for a bit too long, and you see there's some kind of like white mould on the top. And well, what do? You cut off the mould, rest of the cheese, it's probably fine. And in fact, the kind of moulds and cultures that they grow with cheese, you tend to be all right even if you eat a mouldy bit anyway. Now with bread, I used to do exactly the same. Open the bread bin, the slice is mouldy, fine. Cut the mouldy bits off, stick it in the toaster, it'll be fine. I'm sure some of us still probably do the same thing. But then someone informed me, oh no, you really shouldn't do that. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Well, that's because in a loaf of bread, the kind of mould that grows there, the mould is just the fruit of the fungus that has invisibly spread throughout the whole loaf. And so, when you cut the mouldy bits off, you're still eating the fungus. And you might get lucky. It might be a fairly benign fungus, maybe something that produces penicillin. Or you might get very unlucky and eat some fungus that is highly poisonous. And they say, just don't take the risks. And so, against my better nature, I find a mouldy slice of bread, I grit my teeth, and I throw out the whole loaf. If humanity is like mouldy cheese, then there's just a few individuals that we need to deal with and get rid of and throw in prison or whatever, and the rest of us will be fine. But actually, humanity says the Bible's like mouldy bread. There's a problem that spreads in each and every member of the human race. It's just more obvious in some people than others. There are more external signs in other people than in everyone. But verse 12 is universal. God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh corrupted their way on the earth. The state of the world then and now, if we're honest, it's not a pretty picture. So secondly, we encounter God's response. We see this in verse 13. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Although going on to verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you, and of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. There you go, the animals will go into the ark 2 by 2. But God looks at the world, sees how far things have gone, and he plans a dramatic intervention. He's going to wipe out evil from the face of the earth. It's going to be a dramatic refresh, a wiping clean of the slate, a starting again. Imagine we had that opportunity in our own lives. How many of us crave a fresh start? We understand now with our experience and our wisdom where we've messed up in the past, and we'd long to give it another go. Well, maybe that's just a kind of midlife crisis kind of vibe. But I'm sure all of us, whatever stage of life we are, have regrets and wish we could go back and change things. Well, shockingly, Genesis 6 says that what God needs to do with humanity. We are so messed up that he needs to assign his image bearers to the grave and start again. And as with humanity, so with the world. Because we have our special places as God's vicegerents, meaning that the created order fell when we fell. And so the world was messed up even as we got messed up. But if you do know the Adam and Eve story, you'll know that's what God said would happen. Death is what God said would happen if we reject him and walk out on his love and his life. Well, how do you feel about God's response to human evil? Be honest with yourself. I bet to many of us it seems wrong. It's disproportionate, it's excessive, it's unfair. And in my experience as a church worker and vicar, I've spoken to many people who've said to me, that's just not the kind of God that I believe in. Well, my response to that is, we need to examine and understand why we naturally feel like that. Because this is the God that Jesus reveals. The Bible brings us face to face with this God and says it is good news that he is like this. Why is it good news? Well, because love requires justice. Love requires justice. A God of almighty love cannot overlook or dismiss or excuse evil. He wouldn't be loving if he did. Think about the injustices that you've witnessed, or that you've heard about, or that you've experienced personally in your own life. A loving and good God cannot let those things go by unpunished. I can't believe in a God who would look the other way when one of his image bearers abuses another. In this life, we don't see things like the flood happening, do we? We don't see God's direct intervention in judgment right now. But the flood is a picture of what God's going to do at the end of history. That all of us will stand before him on Judgment Day. All of us will have to give an account to him. And that's why it's so wonderful that we see God doesn't only send the flood and judgment, but we see his grace, his undeserved kindness and favour at work. He could just wipe everything out and start completely from scratch. Creation 2.0, version 2. But no, God speaks to Noah and tells him exactly what to do to save himself and to save all who will join him on the ark. It's a pattern we see again and again in Bible history. God takes no delight in judgment, and he loves to offer a way out. He loves to save. He loves to rescue. So that's the state of the world, God's response to it. Well, let's now see Noah's response to God. Noah is a really special person. We see in verse 9, Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Since Adam and Eve had to leave the Garden of Eden, we only see two people who are said to walk with God. The first was Enoch last week, and now Noah. Noah's called righteous. It means he's relating rightly to those around him. He's not filling the earth with violence like all of his contemporaries. And Noah's blameless. He has a clear conscience before God. It's not that he's perfect, but he's walking in relationship with his Maker as we were all made to. And when God warns Noah about the coming flood, Noah believes and Noah obeys. If you reread the chapter at home, you'll find in 4 places, 4 times, we're told Noah did all that God commanded him. Noah obeyed. And by his obedience, he saved his family and the animals as well. Now at this point, we can't dodge the fact that many people would take issue with the historical reality of the flood. I mean, it is physically impossible for there to be a worldwide flood covering the mountains, right? And, then think about the kangaroos. How did the kangaroos get from Australia over the ocean to get to Mesopotamia, which is the kind of cradle of humanity, which is really kind of modern-day Iraq? How did the kangaroos get from there to Mesopotamia to get in the ark? I mean, if you believe in the biblical flood, and if you're a Christian, I hope you do, how would you answer? Well, firstly, I believe that God spoke the world into existence from nothing. That by his power alone, God made the universe. I believe that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. And so a worldwide flood, yes, is impossible by natural physical processes, but God, who upholds and sustains those processes, isn't bound by them. He's free to create a huge volume of water if he wants to, and then to take it away again. He's free to transport the animals from across the world to the ark, however he chooses. But then also, secondly, chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis are prehistory that's been passed on and written down for us by the ancients. And when it says all the earth or all under heaven, it would have been understood as meaning the known world. Noah and his sons wouldn't have known about the far ends of the earth. They wouldn't have known about Australia and other things. So when it says all the world, it might not mean the whole globe as we would understand it today. And so for me personally, and I don't mind if you disagree with me, but for me personally, I think the flood was probably a catastrophic flood on a regional scale, flooding that cradle of humanity in Mesopotamia, all of that ancient world. Still unimaginably cataclysmic, still universal from their perspective in that region. But whatever you think about the flood, don't miss the wood for the trees. God judges humanity except for those who shelter in the ark built by the righteous man Noah. So that's the state of the world, God's response to it, Noah's response to God. And for our last two stops, we're going to zoom out of the Noah story, which, by the way, isn't over. We stopped there at the end of chapter 7, but there's 2 more chapters, so come back next week for the rest of that. But we're going to return to number 4, God's response again. Spoiler alert, the flood was only a temporary fix. The earth was washed clean, but the human heart wasn't. It's why we can still look around the world today and see the same kind of problems. But God keeps showing his grace. His true solution to our problem was to send his son, Jesus. Remember, he loves to rescue. And so Jesus lived the perfect life we should have lived. Noah was relatively righteous amongst his contemporaries. Jesus was perfectly righteous for all time. By Noah's obedience, 8 people were saved in the ark. By Jesus' obedience at the cross, anyone who turns to him can be saved from judgment and death. And so we're going to finish with, 5thly, our response. How do you respond when you look around at the state of the world and at your own heart and soul? Jesus says, come, take shelter under my cross, and the flood of judgment will not touch you. Jesus says, follow me, and I'll give you my righteousness. I'll give you my life to be yours forever. This is the faith that we've just baptized Rosie into, and what we pray for her to grow up to believe for herself and own for herself. How about you? If you'd like to explore more, let me encourage you to use one of those yellow cards and give us your details to join 321 starting in June. Keep coming along here to All Hallows to hear more, because we talk about Jesus every week. Or talk to a Christian friend or one of the team more to ask your questions and find out. And for those of us who are Christians, well, do you believe in God's justice and judgment? Because without it, Jesus' life and death don't make very much sense. They're not really good news. Without God's justice and judgment, our outward drive to make Jesus known in word and deed will be weak. But we are those who found shelter. We found rescue. We found life in walking with Jesus. And there is ample room under his cross. So who can you invite in? Who can you invite to take shelter and trust in Jesus for the coming day? Let me lead us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your justice and your goodness and your mercy, revealed partially here in the story of Noah and received fully in Jesus. Father, please would you help us to believe that you are indeed a God of justice and mercy, and that we, walking faithfully with your Son, might make him known to others. We ask for his name's sake. Amen.
Thank you very much, Johnny.